Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are tackling a claim that sits right at the heart of ancient history, especially when we look at the origins of Christianity,
Yeah, we're focusing on what scholars often call minimal fact one.
which is the death of Jesus by Roman crucifixion.
Exactly. And we've got quite a stack of articles and research here, historical analysis, medical findings, really trying to get a comprehensive look.
And the goal for this deep dive really is to unpack why. Why is this one event considered so historically certain?
Right. We want to explore the layers of evidence presented in these sources. Why do critical scholars, scholars who aren't necessarily believers themselves, almost universally agree that Jesus died this way?
That level of agreement is pretty striking, isn't it?
Yeah.
Especially from historians who are, known for being skeptical.
It absolutely is. The sources really highlight this. You have people like Bart Ehrman, who's definitely not a confessional Christian, stating quite clearly that the crucifixion is probably the most certain historical fact we have about Jesus.
And the reason for that certainty, it's not just one thing, is it? It's this convergence of evidence.
That's right. It's multiply attested independently, which is key in history.
And, as you mentioned, it was actually a problem for the early believers. A big one. An embarrassment, even.
Precisely. The argument in the sources is strong. This isn't the kind of story you'd invent about someone you're proclaiming as, well, the Son of God, a powerful Messiah.
It completely cut against expectations.
It did. It created huge challenges for their message. So the fact that they included it, didn't try to hide it or gloss over it, that points strongly towards it being actual history.
Okay, let's really get into the weeds then. What exactly is the historical evidence that leads to this widespread scholarly agreement?
Well, we can start with that consensus itself, but maybe dig into why they hold it. It comes down to standard historical methods. And the first big one is multiple attestation from independent sources.
Okay, multiple attestation. Sounds a bit academic. What does that mean in practice? How does it help us understand ancient events?
Think of it like building a case for history. If you have a claim and several different witnesses who aren't connected or copying each other, all support that claim.
Your case is much stronger than if you just have one witness, or maybe a few who all heard it from the same person.
Exactly. For ancient history, sources are often scarce. So having multiple independent lines of evidence pointing to the same event, that's incredibly valuable.
So distinct threads of information, not just echoes in the same report.
Precisely. Historian Paul Mayer is quoted in the sources saying, many facts from antiquity we just accept today rest on only one ancient source.
Really? Just one?
Often, yes. So when you get 2 or 3 independent sources confirming something, historians generally consider that fact pretty solid, almost unimpeachable, as Mayer puts it.
Okay, so how many sources are we talking about for the crucifixion specifically? Is it just 2 or 3?
Oh, it's significantly more than that. The sources emphasize Bart Ehrman listing over 20 independent sources overall for the historical Jesus, but for the crucifixion itself. At least 15 of those sources, dated by scholars to within the first 100 years after the event, explicitly corroborate that Jesus was crucified.
15.
Yeah.
Independent sources
Yeah.
within a century. For someone who wasn't, an emperor or a major general, that sounds like a lot.
It is. It's an unusually high number for an ancient figure like this. And these 15 aren't all Christian texts either.
Okay, break that down. What kinds of sources are we talking about?
Well, you've got 10 sources from within the New Testament canon itself, the Gospels, Acts, Paul's letters. But importantly, there are also 5 significant extra-biblical sources from that same early period.
Extra-biblical meaning outside the New Testament. That
Yeah.
seems really important for independent confirmation.
Absolutely crucial. These include the Jewish historian Josephus.
The non-Christian source.
Right. Then early Christian writers outside the NT canon, like Clement of Rome and Ignatius. Their letters were circulating early on. Then you have the Roman historian Tacitus.
Another non-Christian.
Exactly. And even the Gospel of Peter, which is an early non-canonical Christian text, having Josephus and Tacitus mention the crucifixion, writing from completely outside the Christian movement, as really powerful independent weight.
And the sources say you can expand that list even further if you just widen the time frame a little.
Yeah, if you push the time frame out to about 150 years after the crucifixion, say up to around 180, the total number of independent sources mentioning at least Jesus's death climbs to well over 20.
Wow. Who else gets included in that wider net?
Beyond those early ones, you can potentially add references reflected in the later Jewish Talmud. There's the Greek writer Lucian of Samosata.
He was a satirist, wasn't he?
He was, yeah, mocking Christians but confirming elements of their story. Possibly the Samaritan historian Thallus, though his work only survives in fragments quoted much later. We should be careful, though. Some texts people mention, like the Acts of Pilate or the Toledat Yeshu.
Right. The sources say those are generally seen as having little historical value by critical scholars.
Correct. We're focusing on the stronger, earlier evidence here. But even within that slightly later period, you find more confirmation.
From where?
Well, there are Gnostic Christian texts from that era, like the Gospel of Truth or the Treatise on the Resurrection that mention Jesus' death. You have mainstream Orthodox writers like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, and maybe most interestingly, even the pagan critic Celsus.
The philosopher who attacked Christianity.
Yes, we only know his arguments because the Christian writer Origen quoted him extensively to refute him. But in doing so, Origen preserved the fact that Celsus knew Jesus was crucified. He didn't dispute the event, just its significance.
So by about AD 180, you have this convergence from Jewish, Roman, pagan, Orthodox Christian, non-Orthodox Christian sources, all pointing to this one event.
Yeah.
It's quite a mix.
It's precisely that diversity. The number, the independence, the variety of sources, all within a relatively short span for ancient history. The sources describe it as exemplary, perhaps even unparalleled, for an event involving a non-elite figure. Think about how hard it is to verify anything about most people from that time with multiple sources.
It really hammers home that this isn't just based on, say, the Gospels repeating each other.
Not at all. And it vastly exceeds even the minimum benchmarks some skeptical scholars set. The Jesus Seminar, for instance, famously required just 2 independent sources to consider a saying of Jesus possibly authentic.
And here we have 15 plus for the crucifixion.
Easily. Even Bart Ehrman points to this wealth of independent attestation as providing a really powerful historical foundation. But it's not just the number of sources, it's also how early some of this testimony goes back.
Right, the sources highlighted that 30 to 50 period as being critical.
Yes, that's the window between the crucifixion itself, probably around 30 or 33, and the earliest New Testament writings, maybe 1 Thessalonians around 50. This is the absolute earliest layer we could hope to access.
And this is where those early creeds and traditions come in, the ones embedded in later letters.
Exactly. Short, punchy statements of belief or brief summaries of key events. You find them scattered in Paul's letters, like the famous one in 1 Corinthians 15 about the death, burial, and resurrection.
Died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day.
That one. That's the one. Or the account of the Last Supper in 1 Corinthians 11. Scholars also think similar early traditions lie behind parts of the Gospels.
And the crucial point is that scholars, even critical ones, don't think Paul or the gospel writers just made these up.
No, that's a near unanimous consensus. These specific formulations show linguistic signs of being much older than the letters they're in.
Older. How much older?
Linguistic analysis suggests many originated in Aramaic, the language Jesus and his first followers spoke back in Palestine. They likely date to the AD 30s.
Wow. So potentially within just a handful of years of the crucifixion itself.
It's incredibly early. For ancient historical material, that's practically immediate. These creeds are widely seen, even by skeptical scholars, as our best window into what the very first Christians believed and taught before any New Testament books were written down.
A snapshot of the earliest proclamation.
Yes. And the sources point out how centrally focused these early summaries are on Jesus' death and resurrection. They might be brief, but the crucifixion is right there at the core. Scholar Oscar Cullmann suggested they were used constantly in early church life: baptisms, worship, defending the faith, maybe even during persecution.
So they were foundational, practical statements of belief.
Exactly. Their early date and their recognized authority within the first communities make them incredibly important witnesses, acknowledged even by critical historians.
Okay, so abundant independent sources, some incredibly early testimony. What about eyewitnesses? Do the sources suggest eyewitness accounts play a role?
They do explore that possibility. The most consistently identified group, present right at the scene of both the crucifixion and the burial, according to all 4 Gospels.
The women, the female disciples who followed Jesus.
Right. That consistency across all 4 accounts is significant. It's multiply attested. And here's where we hit another one of those factors that paradoxically strengthens the case for historicity.
Yeah.
Well, it's embarrassing.
Embarrassing. How is mentioning the women embarrassing?
Because in the first century world, particularly in Jewish and Roman contexts, women's testimony just didn't carry much weight legally or socially. It was often considered unreliable or inadmissible in court.
Okay, I see.
So for the early Christian movement, trying to convince a skeptical world about these extraordinary events, making women the primary witnesses to the absolutely crucial moments, the death and burial, was a huge disadvantage. It opened them up to easy dismissal. Oh, that's just what the women said.
So it's not a detail you'd invent if you were trying to build the strongest possible case. It actually made their job harder.
Precisely. Why make women your star witnesses unless they actually were the witnesses? The sources argued their prominence is strong evidence for historicity precisely because it was embarrassing and counterproductive from a purely strategic standpoint. It suggests the gospel writers were constrained by the actual facts of who was there.
That's a really powerful point about not inventing details that weaken your own argument.
It is. Now, the sources also discuss potential male witnesses. Their presence is a bit less consistently emphasized right at the crucifixion itself compared to the women.
Who gets mentioned?
John's gospel depicts the disciple John at the foot of the cross. Luke mentions Peter being nearby during the arrest and trial, though not explicitly at the crucifixion. Peter and John are both mentioned visiting the empty tomb later.
And what about Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus? They handled the burial.
Right, they're identified as members of the Jewish council, but also secret followers of Jesus. Joseph famously goes to Pilate to ask for the body. And Mark's gospel includes that detail where Pilate specifically checks with the centurion, the Roman officer, who oversaw the execution to confirm Jesus was really dead before releasing the body.
So Joseph was directly involved in the confirmation of death with the Roman authorities.
Yes. He might not have witnessed the whole crucifixion, but he was definitely involved in the immediate aftermath and ensuring the death was official.
So the women were the core, consistently attested group at the scene, but others had direct involvement or knowledge shortly after.
Yes. And information would have spread quickly within that early group. The women witnesses would have told the male disciples what they saw when they regrouped. Acts chapter 1 suggests they were together soon after. And we know from Paul's letters, like Galatians, that he made specific trips to Jerusalem early on to meet with Peter, James, and John to make sure they were all on the same page regarding the core gospel message.
Which included the death and resurrection.
Absolutely. 1 Corinthians 15.1, Paul explicitly says, whether it was him or the other apostles preaching, the core message, including the death and resurrection, was the same. So there was communication and confirmation happening among the leadership based on the earliest reports.
The accounts weren't just floating in a vacuum.
No, they arose from the experiences and shared knowledge of that first community. Richard Bauckham's work, mentioned in the sources, argues compellingly that the Gospels preserve eyewitness testimony much more directly than previously thought.
Okay, let's shift to another historical tool the sources discuss, the criterion of dissimilarity. How does the crucifixion measure up there?
It measures up extremely well. This is considered one of the strongest arguments for its historicity. The criterion basically says, if a tradition about Jesus is dissimilar, meaning it doesn't fit neatly with or even contradicts what first century Jews generally expected, and it doesn't fit neatly with the later agenda or beliefs of the early Christian church that preserved it, then it's more likely to be authentic history.
So if it's awkward for both the original Jewish context and the later Christian storytellers, it's probably real.
That's the idea, and the crucifixion fits this perfectly. A crucified Messiah. That was just unthinkable for most first century Jews.
They were expecting a conquering hero, right? Someone to defeat the Romans.
Exactly. A powerful political or military figure who would restore Israel and establish God's kingdom visibly. Instead, their supposed Messiah is brutally executed by the Romans, like a common slave or rebel. It was profoundly counterintuitive.
Paul called it a stumbling block.
He did, specifically a stumbling block to Jews. It created, as the sources say, enormous headaches for the Christian mission. Trying to convince fellow Jews that this crucified man was the promised Messiah was an uphill battle because the crucifixion itself seemed to disqualify him in their eyes.
And sources point out it wasn't just other Jews who were surprised. The disciples themselves were shocked.
Yes, their reaction, described as shock, fear, despair, scattering, shows that they didn't expect this either. This wasn't the glorious victory they had envisioned for their leader. Their profound disappointment indicates the crucifixion ran completely counter to their own hopes and expectations for Jesus.
So because it was so unexpected, so contrary to both Jewish hopes and the disciples' own expectations, it's highly unlikely they would have just made it up. It was a massive problem for their narrative, not a helpful plot point.
That's the force of the dissimilarity argument here. It's a detail that actively worked against the early Christian message, making its invention extremely improbable.
Which flows right into the related criterion of embarrassment.
Yes, they're closely linked. The crucifixion wasn't just dissimilar, it was deeply embarrassing on several levels. First, there's the method itself. Under Old Testament law, Deuteronomy 21, anyone hung on a tree was considered cursed by God.
So the very manner of death suggested divine rejection, not divine approval. The exact opposite of what you'd want for your Messiah.
Absolutely. Here's the man claimed to be God's chosen one, blessed and empowered, dying a death associated with God's curse. He failed to defeat the Romans. Instead, he was ignominiously killed by them, alongside criminals. It flew in the face of expected signs of divine favor and messianic identity. How could this figure be the promised king if he ended up cursed and dead?
It must have been a constant question they faced.
Mm-hmm.
How do you explain this apparent contradiction?
Exactly. No wonder Paul had to grapple with the scandal of the cross. But the embarrassment wasn't just the crucifixion method.
You mean the other details we mentioned?
Yes, the sources bring them back under this criterion. The prominence of the female witnesses, it was embarrassing, given their low testimonial status. Again, you wouldn't invent that detail if you were trying to make your story maximally persuasive in that culture.
And the behavior of the male disciples.
Utterly humiliating. Mark and Matthew say they all fled. John depicts them hiding behind locked doors for fear of the Jews, while the women bravely stayed near the cross. Imagine the early church leaders, Peter. The others having to constantly live with and preach a story that highlighted their own cowardice at the most critical moment.
It's hard to picture them inventing that portrayal of themselves.
Very hard. So you have multiple layers of embarrassment. The curse of death itself, the reliance on female testimony, the failure and fear of the male leaders. These details strongly suggest the writers were reporting difficult historical realities, not crafting a flattering or convenient narrative.
Okay, another powerful line of evidence the sources discuss is enemy attestation.
Yes, this is a really valuable tool for historians. Testimony that comes from sources hostile to a person or movement, or even just implicit confirmation from adversaries, is considered particularly strong.
Why is that?
Because enemies have no motive to invent things that help the other side's case. If anything, they'd want to deny or distort. So if a hostile source confirms a particular fact, it's likely because that fact was undeniable or widely known.
So who are the enemies whose testimony supports the crucifixion?
The sources point to two main groups involved in the event. The Jewish leaders who had opposed Jesus and pushed for his execution, and the Roman authorities, the soldiers carrying it out, and Pilate who ordered it.
How does their involvement count as attestation?
Well, the Gospels depict the Jewish leaders present at the crucifixion mocking Jesus. Their presence confirms they witnessed the event, and their eventual departure implies they were satisfied the problem Jesus was dealt with, that he was dead. It's similar to Marcus Borg's point about them implicitly acknowledging Jesus' works by attributing them to Satan. Their opposition confirms the event happened, even if their interpretation is hostile.
And the Roman soldiers.
Their role is even stronger testimony. They were the execution squad. They stayed until the job was done. And Roman military discipline was brutal. The sources remind us of Acts 12, where the guards responsible for Peter were executed when he escaped.
So the soldiers carrying out the crucifixion had a very strong personal incentive to make absolutely sure Jesus was dead before they left. Their own lives could be on the line if he somehow wasn't.
Exactly. Their professional duty and self-preservation demanded certainty, and then there's that specific interaction involving Pilate.
When Joseph of Arimathea asks for the body.
Yes. Mark's gospel explicitly states, and it's implied in others, that Pilate was surprised Jesus had died already and summoned the centurion, the officer who was physically present, supervising the crucifixion, to verify the death before he would release the body for burial.
So you have an official check, ordered by the Roman governor himself, confirming the death with the officer in charge at the scene.
Precisely. That's a powerful confirmation from the executing authority. So you have this chain. Jewish leaders satisfied he's dead, Roman soldiers needing him to be dead, the centurion confirming it to Pilate, and Pilate acting on that confirmation. It's multiple checks from groups who had reasons to be sure.
What about the guard at the tomb mentioned in Matthew? Does that count as enemy attestation?
The sources note that most critical scholars tend to view the story of the guard at the tomb as a later apologetic addition by Matthew, responding to rumors that the disciples stole the body. However, some recent scholarship suggests it might reflect an earlier tradition. If it were historical, it would be another layer. The enemies, chief priests and Pharisees, acting on the certainty of Jesus' death and burial by taking steps to prevent fraud, but even setting that aside as debated.
The confirmations from the leaders at the cross, the soldiers, the centurion, and Pilate are already quite strong.
Yes, the sources describe this sequence of confirmations from various adversarial or official parties as providing weighty attestation that Jesus really died.
And this leads directly to another point the sources emphasize, just how unlikely survival from crucifixion actually was.
Right. Scholar Michael Licona is highlighted for stressing this. Surviving a full Roman crucifixion carried through to completion, it was exceptionally rare, perhaps even unheard of.
And the sources cite that account from Josephus.
Yes, the first-century historian Josephus recounts finding 3 of his friends crucified. He personally intervened with the Roman commander Titus, and they were taken down from their crosses before the process was finished, specifically in an attempt to save them.
So they were rescued early, while still alive.
Correct. They received the best medical care available at the time, and yet, despite early rescue and medical attention, 2 of the 3 still died.
Wow. Even with rescue and treatment, the odds were terrible.
Exactly. And that was for men taken down early. The sources speculate it's possible that no one ever survived a completed Roman crucifixion where the soldiers finished their work and left the person for dead.
Which makes the chances of Jesus surviving, especially after the scourging and everything else, astronomically low.
That's the point. The historical probability is overwhelmingly against survival. And, critically, as the sources stress, there's 0 historical evidence suggesting Jesus was removed early or received any medical care. The accounts depict a full execution. This reality directly counters theories like the old swoon theory.
The idea he just fainted and later recovered.
Yes, the historical likelihood, based on what we know about crucifixion and the Josephus account, makes that scenario incredibly improbable.
So putting it all together, the sheer number and variety of independent sources, the extremely early creedal testimony, the embarrassing details like female witnesses and fleeing disciples, the fact it fits the dissimilarity criterion so well, the confirmations from hostile Roman and Jewish figures, and the inherent lethality of crucifixion itself, it builds a really formidable historical case.
It really does. It's why you see scholars across the spectrum, Ehrman, Krossenborg, Ludman, even those deeply skeptical of Christian claims, agree that Jesus' death by crucifixion is perhaps the single most solid, indisputable fact about his life.
Okay, so the historical evidence is overwhelming, that Jesus was put on a cross and that everyone involved believed he died there. But how can we be medically certain he actually died? What does the science say about how crucifixion kills?
That's the crucial next step. The medical evidence complements the historical evidence by exploring the physiological mechanisms. It helps answer how crucifixion causes death and addresses whether survival was even physiologically plausible.
And the sources mention that while crucifixion methods could vary, doctors generally agree death wasn't usually from one single thing. It was multifactorial.
Exactly. Multifactorial meaning multiple factors contributed and interacted to cause death. It wasn't like a simple gunshot wound. The sources list a range of potential contributing causes, often working together. Things like hypovolemic shock from blood loss, especially after scourging, severe dehydration, exhaustion, possibly congestive heart failure, fluid building up in the lungs or around the heart, pulmonary edema or pericardial effusion, maybe blood clots like a pulmonary embolism, disruption of blood clotting factors, and something called suspension trauma from just hanging there.
So a whole cascade of physiological breakdown.
Pretty much. Any one of these could be primary, or they could combine to overwhelm the body's systems. But among all these potential factors, one explanation tends to dominate the medical literature on crucifixion.
And that is?
Asphyxiation, difficulty breathing leading to suffocation. The sources call it the most common explanation and the most popular observation at present. One review mentioned tallied over 40 medical studies, and asphyxiation came out as the favored explanation by about a 2-to-1 margin over all other causes combined.
Okay, how does crucifixion lead to asphyxiation? What's the mechanism?
The most widely described mechanism relates to the body's position, especially if the arms are stretched outwards, maybe slightly upwards. In that sort of low-hanging position, the body's weight pulls down on the chest.
Right.
This puts the rib cage in an inhaled position and puts immense strain on the muscles needed for breathing, the intercostal muscles between the ribs, the pectoral muscles in the chest, the deltoids in the shoulders. It becomes incredibly difficult and painful to exhale fuller and then take another breath.
So the victim is constantly fighting just to breathe.
Exactly. To get a decent breath, they'd have to push up with their legs if nailed through the feet or pull up with their arms. This would momentarily relieve the tension on the chest muscles, allowing them to exhale and inhale. But doing that push-up motion would put excruciating pain on the nailed feet or wrists.
And it would get harder and harder to do that.
Yes, because of mounting exhaustion from the effort, blood loss from scourging, and the nails, shock, dehydration, heat, the sheer agony. It's a downward spiral. Eventually, they can't push up anymore. They slump down.
And staying in that slumped down position means they can't breathe effectively.
Right. Carbon dioxide builds up in the blood. Oxygen levels plummet. Asphyxiation happens relatively quickly then. Thomas Miller also adds the point that it's not just about getting air in and out. It's also about oxygen delivery. The blood loss from scourging means less hemoglobin to carry oxygen to the tissues, which contributes to organ failure and death, all made worse by the pain and exhaustion.
It sounds horrifically efficient as a method of execution.
It's described as ingenious in its brutality precisely because it uses the body's own weight and physiological responses to guarantee death, usually culminating in asphyxiation and cardiac arrest, without needing a specific fatal action from the executioner until perhaps the very end. Simply remaining slumped meant death was occurring, or had occurred.
Now, the sources do mention some debate about this, specifically involving the research of Frederick Zugib.
Yes, Zugib was a forensic pathologist who did experiments with volunteers. He actually concluded that the asphyxiation theory was, in his words, completely untenable when tested empirically.
Okay, how did his experiments work, and why did they lead him to challenge the standard view?
He suspended volunteers, not with nails, obviously, but using things like wrist gauntlets and foot supports or belts, often with their arms at about a 60 to 70 degree angle from the body. He monitored their breathing, heart rate, blood oxygen.
And what did he find?
His volunteers reported pain, especially in the arms and shoulders, and tended to breathe more with their abdomen, but crucially, they rarely reported severe difficulty breathing. Sometimes their blood oxygen even went up, maybe from hyperventilating due to pain or stress. He concluded shock was more likely the primary cause of death than asphyxiation.
Were there other experiments like this?
Yeah, the sources mentioned earlier work by Pierre Barbet using cadavers and observations from concentration camps. Hermann Mutter also used volunteers, but seemed to get different results that supported breathing difficulty. Another pathologist, Robert Buckland, reportedly even tried suspending himself briefly and felt muscle spasms hindered his chest breathing.
So, conflicting experimental results. What seems to be the key difference?
A lot of it seems to boil down to the angle of the arms and whether the legs could be used effectively for support. Zugib found breathing got harder the closer the arms were to being directly overhead. Other setups, like barbades or mutters, or cases where the legs couldn't support the body weight effectively, seem to align better with the asphyxiation model.
But Zugib's experiments themselves faced criticism, didn't they?
Yes, quite significant critiques, highlighted by researchers like Maslin and Mitchell. The main one is authenticity.
Meaning the volunteers weren't really crucified.
Exactly. No prior scourging leading to massive blood loss and shock. No exhaustion from carrying the crossbeam, no dehydration, intense heat, prolonged psychological terror, or obviously the agony of being nailed. The conditions just weren't comparable.
And the duration was different too.
Right. The volunteers were suspended for relatively short periods, limited by their discomfort, not for the hours or even days that Roman crucifixions could last. Maslin and Mitchell argue that because the conditions were so different, Zugib's findings about breathing difficulty in his specific setup have only limited relevance and aren't decisive for real crucifixions.
Did they critique his shock hypothesis too?
Yes, they pointed out that Zugib didn't actually provide strong empirical evidence from his own experiments proving shock was the primary cause, even though he proposed it. There were also questions raised about whether his reconstruction might have been influenced by things like the Shroud of Turin or traditional artwork, maybe assuming specific positions that aren't historically certain.
Okay, so there are questions about how applicable Zugib's experiments are, but the sources connect this whole medical debate back to a historical practice. Crucifixion, breaking the legs.
Yes, and this connection is really interesting. It seems to loop back and support the plausibility of asphyxiation being a key factor understood even by the Romans.
How so?
We know, historically, and from John's Gospel, that Romans sometimes broke the legs of crucifixion victims. Why would they do that? Medically, breaking the legs would make it impossible for the victim to push up.
Which, according to the asphyxiation theory, is how they relieved the pressure on their chest to breathe.
Exactly. So the fact that Romans used crucifixion specifically to hasten death strongly suggests they knew that preventing the victim from pushing up would kill them faster. And the most logical way that works is by inducing asphyxiation more quickly. It implies the Romans themselves recognized this respiratory mechanism.
And the sources raise that intriguing question about Zugieb's experiments.
Right. What if Zugieb's volunteers had their legs immobilized, like a crucifixion victim, or like subjects in some of the other experiments where legs couldn't support weight or arms were higher? Would they have started to asphyxiate then?
The argument being they could breathe because they could still use their legs during the short tests.
Precisely. Take away the leg support, and maybe Zugieb's scenario starts looking a lot more like Mutter's or Barbades, where asphyxiation seemed likely.
So, wrapping up the medical cause of death. While maybe not 100% unanimous on the single primary cause, asphyxiation remains the easily most common medical view, probably as a major part of that multifactorial cascade leading to eventual cardiac arrest.
That seems to be the consensus position presented in the sources. The combination of trauma, shock, exhaustion, dehydration, and respiratory compromise simply overwhelmed the body's ability to function.
Okay, so we have the historical certainty of crucifixion and a strong medical understanding of why it's fatal. Now, the sources discuss specific actions sometimes taken near the end, the death blows.
Yes, these were things the executioners might do, either to speed things up if the victim was lingering too long, or, just as importantly, to be absolutely certain the person was dead and not just unconscious. Remember, the soldiers' lives could be forfeit if the prisoner wasn't truly dead.
The first method mentioned is crucifixion, breaking the legs, which we just talked about in relation to asphyxiation.
Right. John's Gospel gives that detailed account. The Jewish leaders wanting the bodies down before the Sabbath, asking Pilate to have the legs broken. The soldiers then break the legs of the two men crucified with Jesus.
But not Jesus's legs.
Correct. John says they saw he was already dead, so they skipped that step for him. And this practice, crucifixion, isn't just in John. It's attested elsewhere in ancient sources.
Like where?
Cicero mentions it. It shows up in non-canonical texts like the Gospel of Peter and the Acts of Andrew. And we even have archaeological evidence of the bones of Jehohanan, a first-century crucifixion victim found near Jerusalem, showed his legs had been broken.
So, John describing leg breaking fits with known Roman practices. It's not some weird, unique detail.
Not at all. It was a known, if brutal, part of the Roman toolkit for execution or punishment, lending historical plausibility to John's account.
The other specific action mentioned is the spear thrust, also unique to John's Gospel.
Yes. John 19.34. After seeing Jesus was already dead, one soldier pierces his side with a spear, and John specifically notes the outflow of blood and water. He follows this immediately with a strong affirmation of eyewitness testimony.
And this was explicitly after they decided he was dead.
That's how John presents it, a post-mortem act, done for the sake of assurance, to make doubly sure. The Greek word used for side, pleura, typically refers to the chest area, the rib cage region.
Is this practice a soldier delivering a final weapon blow, also confirmed outside the Gospels?
It seems so. The sources point to evidence for this kind of coup de grace. Quintilian, a Roman writer, mentions burial being allowed for those who have been pierced on crosses, implying it happened. Origen later calls piercing the bodies a Roman's custom. Even the critical scholar Duncan Derrett acknowledged this part of John's account was likely historical because, as he put it, jabbing was indeed a Roman practice to ensure death.
So both the leg breaking for the others and the spear thrust for Jesus fit within a framework of known Roman execution practices aimed at ensuring death.
They do, which provides historical context supporting John's details. Now, the sources do tackle the questions sometimes raised about the historicity of the spear thrust, mainly because only John mentions it.
The argument from silence again. If it happened, why didn't Matthew, Mark, or Luke include it?
And the sources make the point, quite effectively I think, that the argument from silence is often weak. So many details about Jesus, even important ones, are only in one gospel. Think about the nails used in crucifixion.
Right, you mentioned that earlier.
The actual use of nails is only explicitly mentioned, almost in passing, in John's resurrection account, where Thomas wants to see the marks. The other Gospels just say, they crucified him. They don't specify nails.
That's incredible. We picture nails as essential, but only John mentions them explicitly, yet his account of the spear is questioned for being unique to him.
It really highlights the inconsistency of applying the argument from silence selectively. Omission doesn't equal denial.
What about the other common objection? That John included the spear thrust, mainly for its theological symbolism, the blood and water representing sacraments or fulfilling prophecy, rather than because it historically happened.
The sources definitely acknowledge John saw deep theological meaning there. He often does that. But the key point they make is an author finding theological significance in an event doesn't mean the event itself is unhistorical. You can report a fact and interpret its meaning.
Like the sports historian describing the winning touchdown and its symbolic importance to the team, the interpretation doesn't erase the touchdown.
Exactly. Reporting and interpreting aren't mutually exclusive. So what are the positive reasons the sources give for accepting the spear thrust as historical?
Yes, what are those?
Four main ones. First, it fits coherently with the breaking of the other two men's legs. The soldiers had a job: ensure all three were dead before the Sabbath deadline. Breaking legs on two, then seeing the third already dead, a final confirmatory spear thrust makes logical sense as part of completing that task thoroughly.
Just making absolutely sure.
Right. Second, as we just discussed, the practice of a finishing wound, or coup de grace, is independently attested in Roman contexts. John isn't describing something out of the blue. It fits a known pattern.
Okay, coherence and external attestation.
Third, the whole scenario just checks out from a practical standpoint. The Roman soldiers needed certainty to protect themselves. The Jewish leaders needed certainty before the Sabbath. A final, visible wound provided that certainty for everyone involved. It aligns with the motivations and pressures of the situation.
Makes sense.
And fourth, John's own explicit claim in verse 35, he who saw it has testified. His testimony is true. He knows he tells the truth, while obviously a claim within the text, is presented as a strong assertion of eyewitness basis. It reads like an emphasis on factual reporting, countering the idea it's just theology.
So taken together, there are solid historical arguments supporting the plausibility of John's account of the spear thrust, and the word used, pierced.
The Greek word nasein. While it can mean a light poke, the context John provides the resulting flow of blood and water, and later Thomas being invited to put his hand into the wound strongly suggests a substantial penetrating thrust, not just a surface nick.
A wound big enough to put a hand into is definitely more than a poke.
Seems clear. So the historical context, the narrative logic, the language used, they all point towards this being a real, final, confirmatory wound.
Okay, let's turn to the medical side of that spear thrust. The detail about blood and water flowing out has generated a lot of discussion.
It really has. Medical professionals have spent considerable time analyzing what physiological conditions could produce that specific result from a chest wound in someone recently deceased from crucifixion.
What's the leading medical explanation?
The majority view seems to be that the spear likely entered the chest cavity, piercing the pericardium, that's the sac around the heart, and possibly the heart itself, most likely the right side or atrium.
And where would the blood and water come from?
The water would likely be pericardial fluid, serous fluid that lubricates the heart, which can increase in volume under stress, or possibly pleural fluid from the space around the lungs. The blood would come from the heart chamber, or perhaps blood pooled in the pleural space.
And the sources emphasize that dead bodies can bleed, right? Doesn't mean the person was alive.
Correct. That's an important clarification. Post-mortem bleeding from a wound, especially involving major vessels or cavities, is definitely possible.
What about that other theory, Sava's idea about pleural effusion from the scourging?
Dr. Sava proposed that the scourging might have caused significant fluid buildup, a bloody pleural effusion in the chest cavity. He thought this fluid might separate into layers, a heavier bloody layer below, and a clearer watery layer above, which were then released by the spear.
But that view isn't widely accepted now.
It seems to have been largely superseded. Many subsequent medical reviewers felt there wasn't enough evidence that scourging would reliably cause that specific kind of massive layered effusion, or that it would flow out exactly as described. Pathologists like Buckland noted that evidence sometimes cited, like the Shroud of Turin, didn't necessarily show the kind of chest trauma Saba's theory required. The explanation involving piercing the pericardium and/or heart is generally considered more anatomically plausible by the majority of medical commentators cited.
So while the exact source of the fluids might be debated slightly, the medical consensus is that the described wound is consistent with a deep, probably fatal, thrust into the chest cavity, capable of releasing both blood and a clear fluid.
Yes, that seems to be the key takeaway. The described result is medically plausible for a post-mortem wound to that area, and crucially, the vast majority of these medical analysts agree with John's narrative timing. This was a post-mortem blow.
Which again reinforces the historical accounts that the soldiers checked first and found him dead.
Exactly. The medical interpretation supports the narrative sequence. And there's one more fascinating medical point related to this, brought up by Zugiv, actually, despite his different views on the cause of death, the sucking chest wound idea.
A sucking chest wound. What's that?
If the spear had pierced the chest wall while Jesus was still alive, creating an opening into the pleural space, causing a pneumothorax or collapsed lung, then with each breath attempt, air would likely be sucked into the chest cavity through the wound. This often creates a noticeable, audible sucking sound.
A sound that would be a clear sign of breathing, of life.
Unmistakably. Zugi mentioned hearing one across a room in a modern medical situation. The sources argue that the complete absence of any mention of such a sound or any report of gasping, struggling, or other signs of life after the spear thrust acts as another subtle check and balance. If he'd been alive, that wound likely would have produced obvious signs. The silence supports the conclusion he was already dead.
So pulling the medical and historical threads together again. The extreme unlikelihood of surviving crucifixion based on historical accounts like Josephus, the multiple confirmations of death by authorities, the medical understanding of crucifixion's lethal mechanisms, the evidence supporting the spear thrust as a real post-mortem fatal wound. It all points overwhelmingly against survival.
It does. The sources really stress that alternative theories, like the swoon hypothesis, rely on incredibly slight possibilities, flying in the face of the strong historical probabilities established by the combined evidence.
Which leads us perfectly to what the sources present as almost the final nail in the coffin, so to speak. For the swoon theory, an argument from a very unlikely source. The critic David F. Strauss.
Yes, David Friedrich Strauss, a major figure in 19th century German biblical criticism. Very liberal, very critical, definitely did not believe in a literal supernatural resurrection. But he absolutely demolished the then popular swoon theory.
The idea that Jesus just fainted, seemed dead, was put in the tomb, and revived.
Exactly. That was a common naturalistic explanation at the time. But Strauss pointed out a massive, fatal flaw in that theory. It completely failed to explain the effect the appearances had on the disciples.
And he had that incredibly vivid quote about it.
He did. It's worth hearing, essentially. It is impossible that a being who had stolen half dead out of the sepulchre, who crept about weak and ill, wanting medical treatment, bandaging, strengthening, could have given the disciples the impression that he was a conqueror over death and the grave, the Prince of Life.
He's basically saying a revived victim would look pathetic, not triumphant.
Precisely. Strauss's logic was devastatingly simple. A Jesus who barely survived crucifixion, who was weak, injured, needing intensive care, such a figure would have elicited pity, maybe disillusionment. He would have undermined the disciples' prior belief in him, not transformed them into bold preachers of a resurrection victory. How could this half-dead, suffering man convince anyone he had conquered death?
And yet, the historical record, even acknowledged by skeptics, shows the disciples were transformed. They went from frightened and scattered to proclaiming his resurrection with incredible boldness, forming the absolute epicenter, as the sources put it, of the early Christian movement.
That's the core of Strauss's critique. You have an undeniable historical effect, the disciples' powerful, transformative resurrection belief. The swoon theory proposes a cause, a barely revived, sickly Jesus that is completely incapable of producing that effect. In fact, it would produce the opposite effect.
So Strauss concluded the swoon theory must be wrong.
Yes, because it fundamentally could not explain the known historical outcome, the birth of the Christian faith fueled by resurrection belief. His critique was so effective, it largely killed the swoon theory as a credible option in serious critical scholarship.
So, ironically, this major critic of the resurrection provided one of the most compelling arguments for the fact that Jesus actually died.
Exactly. By showing the alternative, apparent death couldn't explain the subsequent historical events, he indirectly forced even critics to accept the actual death by crucifixion as the necessary starting point. It's a powerful argument from effect.
Wow. Okay, this has been an incredibly thorough deep dive. The sheer volume and variety of evidence pointing to Jesus' death by crucifixion is really quite stunning when you lay it all out.
It is. It's a convergence from many different angles.
Let's just quickly recap the main lines of evidence we've covered that build this case.
Okay. First, the sheer weight of multiple independent historical sources, well over a dozen, maybe over 20, from diverse backgrounds, all within a short historical window.
Then the extremely early testimony found in pre-Pauline creeds and traditions, dating back possibly to the first few years after the event.
The evidence from eyewitness accounts, paradoxically strengthened by the inclusion of embarrassing details, like the prominence of female witnesses and the flight of the male disciples.
The crucifixion, passing the criterion of dissimilarity because a suffering, executed Messiah was the opposite of what was expected, making it unlikely to be invented.
Multiple layers of embarrassment woven into the accounts that argue against fabrication.
The strong enemy attestation confirmations of death from the Jewish leaders present, the Roman soldiers who needed certainty, the centurion's report, and Pilate's official verification.
The coherence of the accounts with known Roman practices like crucifixion and the coup de grace or finishing wound.
Then the medical evidence showing crucifixion was inherently lethal, with asphyxiation being the most common explanation within a multifactorial process leading to death.
The medical plausibility of the specific death blows described, like the spear thrust producing blood and water, interpreted as a post-mortem confirmation. Even the lack of a sucking chest sounds supporting death having already occurred.
And finally, Strauss's devastating critique showing the swoon theory simply cannot account for the historically undeniable transformation of the disciples and the rise of resurrection faith.
And as mentioned, potential, though debated, corroboration from forensic signs on the Shroud of Turin, though the case stands very strong without it.
It's the convergence of all these threads that's so compelling.
It really is, which is why, as the sources constantly reiterate, critical scholars across the theological spectrum, Ehrman, Ludemann, Crossan, Borg, regard Jesus' death by crucifixion as arguably the most secure fact we possess about his life.
And it's foundational, right? His death is central to the Christian message itself. And logically, you have to establish the death before you can even begin to talk about what might have happened next.
Absolutely. It's the necessary starting point for any historical investigation into Christian origins. The evidence provides an incredibly solid foundation for that starting point.
So let's leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. Consider this convergence we've discussed. Evidence for this one brutal event comes from Roman administrative and military practices, from Jewish religious expectations and laws, from the basic physics of human respiration under extreme stress, from the physiological effects of trauma and shock, even from the psychological dynamics of belief formation in a group. What does it tell us when so many different independent lines of inquiry, history, medicine, sociology, textual criticism all point towards the same conclusion? What might this dense web of confirmation suggest about how we can approach historical questions and the often surprising ways evidence from different fields can interlock to establish a historical reality?
It really makes you appreciate that historical truth often emerges not from one knockout source, but from the careful weaving together of multiple strands of data, sometimes from unexpected places.
Something definitely worth reflecting on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.